Hello and welcome to today's SC Launch and Learn with Russ Keller of ATI. Today we are discussing OTAs, or Other Transaction Agreements, and the consortium business model. Before we begin, I'd like to go over two housekeeping items. First of all, if you can hear me, please raise your hand in the webinar controls. All right, Kella, David, Blair, welcome. Thank you so much. We can go ahead and lower those hands. Secondly, on the format of today's webinar, we'll be keeping all of the audience audio muted. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the webinar controls at any time. I'm going to go ahead and pause the presentation about halfway through, and we will open up that Q&A line. I will be reading the questions out loud and Russ will be answering them. Then we'll also do a little Q&A at the end of the webinar. So we're going to go ahead and begin now. My name is Julia Linton and I serve as the operations manager for the SC Launch program here at SCRA. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Russ Keller. We're excited to have him. He is the Senior VP of Medical and Software Division at ATI, Advanced Technology International, located right here in Summerville, South Carolina. He'll be hosting our webinar today. And Russ, I'd like to hand it over to you. Welcome and thank you for being here with us.
Thanks, Julia, and good morning, everybody. I appreciate all of you taking time out of your busy schedules to join this webinar. My plan is to be respectful of your time as we proceed through this overview. My goal is to preserve about half of our available time to take your questions. My role at ATI is helping design and build public-private partnerships, including those that operate under other transactions authorities granted to the Department of Defense. And in that capacity, I'd like to discuss the truly unique other transactions business model that has become increasingly attractive to the federal government R&D sponsors. So my plan is to provide about 20 to 25 minutes of overview of the other transactions vehicle, highlight some of the features that make this acquisition tool particularly attractive, both from the perspective of a small business entering into the federal R&D marketplace, as well as from the perspective of various federal government sponsors who are responsible for delivering mission-critical technologies to the nation. As Julia mentioned, should you have questions during the overview, please send them to us via the webinar link. Julia will collect them. I'll take a pause about midway through the presentation and answer those that have collected to that point, and then we'll do another Q&A session at the conclusion of the briefing. Following the webinar, we'll provide a complete set of questions and answers to all who participated today. Next slide. So I graduated near the bottom of my PowerPoint 101 class, but I do remember that in PowerPoint etiquette, you're supposed to tell the audience what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then upon conclusion, you tell them what you just told them. So here's my outline for today, and as a final note of housekeeping, I've scrubbed my notes diligently in an attempt to define every acronym in this presentation the first time that it appears. If you happen to detect a violation in my adherence to this protocol, please feel free to poke me electronically for missing an acronym. Next slide. Before we move on to the history, mechanics, and other details, take a quick high-level view of other transactions agreements, OTAs. OTA is really just a contract vehicle, and it provides a streamlined way for the government, particularly the Department of Defense, to fund research and develop new technology. It's an alternative to the typical way the government buys stuff. The Federal Acquisition Regulations, FAR, are a really complex set of rules. By the time you employ all of them, it adds time to the buying process. It's daunting for small companies that have great technological capabilities, but not a vast amount of experience or a room full of lawyers and accountants to deal with government contracting. Next slide. There's a common misperception that OTs are relatively new, but OT authority actually began in 1958 in response to the Soviet Union's launching of Sputnik. The successful launch of Sputnik into orbit was a shock to the U.S., and it made us realize we were behind in the space race. As a result, Congress took action and passed the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, which established NASA and charged that agency to quickly develop a national space program and restore the U.S. as the preeminent nation in outer space activities. The Space Act granted NASA broad authority to enter into other transactions that structure research and development agreements with flexibility and are not subject to most of the laws and regulations of government contracts. The intent was to facilitate NASA's ability to reach out directly to innovative, non-traditional performers to get cutting-edge technology in this new agency to develop quickly and be able to accomplish its mission and win the space race. Next slide. OTs were used almost exclusively from the 1950s to the 1980s as a means for the government to engage with individual companies to purchase specific critical technologies. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, was granted OT authority in the mid-1990s. And since then, nearly half of all the federal government departments and agencies have been given similar authority to use OTAs. Although many federal departments have the authority, few, other than the Department of Defense, use the OT authority regularly. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Department of Defense began using its OT authority to work with a consortium of technology providers. This allows resource sponsors to solicit proposals for their entire portfolio of technology needs through a common set of processes. 11 agencies currently have OT authority, and OT authority use has grown to $2.4 billion in OT-related contracts in 2017, $4 billion in 2018, and more than $7.5 billion in 2019. Next slide. There's been a lot of buzz around OTAs, particularly in the last few years as their use has exploded. If you read government publications, you've heard of them. So we're going to go into a little bit of detail about the authority itself. OTA, Other Transactions Agreement, is a legally enforceable contract between the federal government and an organization or a consortium of organizations. Defense Department OTs can be used for research and for prototypes, kinds of activities that need to draw from the widest pool of innovative providers, and are an alternative to traditional government contracting that can lack the speed and flexibility to attract the best and brightest companies in doing work with the government. DoD's authority to use OTs is codified in U.S. statutes related to DoD procurement. These governing statutes are amended from time to time in the annual National Defense Authorization Acts passed by Congress and approved by the President. There are two types of OTs. The 10 U.S.C. 2371 states the OTA is a transaction other than contracts, cooperative agreements, and grants to carry out basic, applied, and advanced research. Typically, these kinds of OTs go to universities, and there's a 50% cost share requirement on all projects. The 10 U.S.C. 2371B, Other Transaction Agreement, provides the ability to carry out prototype projects directly relevant to enhancing mission effectiveness of military personnel and the supporting platforms, systems, components, or material proposed to be acquired or developed by the DoD, including a provision for follow-on production if the prototype is successful. Next slide, please. So if you're familiar with government contracting, you likely know about the FAR. There's a fairly long list of procurement requirements invoked under the FAR that are specifically exempt from acquisitions made under OT authority. I won't describe all of them, but rather I'll highlight a couple of the biggest hitters. First, typically small businesses or companies that don't usually work with the DoD do not have the financial and accounting infrastructure that's required by the FAR in order to do contract work with the government. This means that these companies are unable to bid on certain government requirements. Under an OTA, however, these companies are not precluded from doing R&D work since these standards are not required and, in fact, are accomplished by the consortium manager in the case of an OT consortium. Second, FAR-based government contracts tend to have restrictive intellectual property requirements that can be unattractive for small businesses and for the investment community that may be interested in taking equity in promising small businesses. In the OT environment, IP terms and conditions can be more flexible and negotiable. Third, at the back end of the process, once the government decides to award a particular project, that decision cannot be challenged by one of the non-selected offerers. Given the increasing number of government procurements that are stalled by these procurement challenges, this exemption can save many months between source selection and the start of work, an attractive feature for both the government and for the technology provider alike. Next slide. Since the vast majority of opportunities for small businesses are in the OT for prototypes lane and not in the OT for research lane, I'm going to focus exclusively on the OT for prototypes going forward. I mentioned earlier that the 10 USC 2371B OTAs must be used to develop prototypes meeting a critical government need. However, the term prototype is not defined in the statute. The latest guidance provided by the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which was published in November of 2018, says that a prototype is a physical, virtual, or theoretical model used to evaluate the technical or manufacturing feasibility or effectiveness of what is intended to come later. In order to be compliant with 10 USC 2371B, prototype projects must be directly relevant to enhancing the mission effectiveness of military personnel and the supporting platform systems, components, and materials proposed to be acquired or developed by DoD, or to improvement of platform systems, components, or materials used by the armed forces. So this is the playing field for the OTs around which all of the OT consortia are built. Next slide. This is a key point in implementing the authority for prototype projects. The Department of Defense can use its OT authority for prototype projects under at least one of the four conditions below. First, at least one non-traditional defense contractor or nonprofit research institution participates to a significant extent in the prototype project. I'll touch on what non-traditional defense contractor and significant extent means in the next couple slides. Number two, all significant participants in the transaction, other than the government, are small businesses as defined in the Small Business Act, or are non-traditional defense contractors. Third, at least 1/3 of the total cost of the prototype project is paid out of funds provided by sources other than the federal government. That's procurement code for cost share 1/3 if you don't have a small business or non-traditional participating. And then the fourth option is the agency's senior procurement executive determines that there are exceptional circumstances that exist. In our experience, this option has never been used. Next slide. So back to the definition of non-traditional defense contractor. A non-traditional defense contractor is an organization that has not previously done contract R&D business with the federal government, where the full cost accounting standards were required. Now that's different than having done grant-based work, but this is for contract R&D. Virtually all small businesses qualify as non-traditional defense contractors, but not all non-traditional defense contractors are small businesses. There are some large businesses out there who are non-traditionals because they have chosen not to seek federal R&D contracts. The Department of Defense is interested in tapping into R&D being developed by the non-traditional defense contractors and in commercial solutions to their defense needs. The DoD guide states that the non-traditional contractor can be any member of the project team, provided the business unit makes a significant contribution to the overall accomplishment of the prototype project. Next slide. Significant participation is also not defined in the statute, but the DoD Guide for OTs provides the following guidance. The agreements officer should consider whether the non-traditional defense contractor will supply a new key technology, a product or process, supply a novel application or approach to an existing technology, quality, versatility of a key technology, product or process, accomplish a significant amount of the prototype project work, cause a material reduction in the cost or schedule of the project, or provide for a material increase in performance of the prototype project. So any of those criteria could be applied to meet the definition of significant participation. And once you satisfy that definition, then that would alleviate the need for any members of the project team to provide any cost share. I would note that I would think everybody on this call, that's one of the beauties of the statute that governs these other transactions agreements. There is a strong financial incentive for companies to figure out how to get one of these non-traditional contractors, one of these small businesses, to play a key role on a project team. So even if you're a little guy with 4 or 6 employees, if you've got the right technology, you can partner with somebody else, and the sheer value of your innovative technology makes you attractive to the large company partner, because that company would need to pay 1/3 cost share if they weren't partnered with you. Next slide. And here's another great thing for small businesses. After a prototype is successfully developed, the government can use its OT authority to purchase follow-on production of the technology if the company's prototype project is awarded under competitive procedures and if the prototype itself proves successful. So under the current practices under the federal acquisition regulations, if you have a successful prototype, it's game over, and then the government has the right to then compete for somebody to come in behind and produce what you just proved successfully in your prototype. Under the OT statutes, if the project was awarded competitively, and all of them are, and your project is successful, then that project team is eligible to receive a sole source follow-on production contract, which obviates the need for another solicitation cycle and another 9 or 10 months delay before moving into production. Next slide. So here's the first pause in the briefing, and I will let Julia collect any questions that have come in thus far. And Julia, go ahead and fire away.
Great. Thank you so much, Russ. I'll let you take a sip of water, and I see some questions being typed in right now. We will wait just a minute for those questions. Always one of the standard questions that come in has hit the table. It says, can we get a copy of this amazing presentation? And the answer is always yes. You can definitely receive a copy of this after the webinar. The GoToWebinar takes about 20 minutes to process the audio and the visual aid component of this together. So by the end of today, it will be posted on the SCRA website, and all you have to do is click and you can get a copy of the audio and the PowerPoint together for your viewing. So it will be made definitely available. Thank you. All right, any other questions coming in? Don't hesitate to type them in. I don't see anything coming in right now. Maybe it will just be another 30 seconds. We'll wait for questions, and then we will hand it back over to Russ to continue on his consortium model discussion. Oh, it looked like I had a hand. So you're welcome to raise your hand. I'm not able to unmute you, but you're welcome to raise your hand and then either type the questions into the chat box, or you can type the questions into the webinar controls. Great, Dean, thank you so much. Russ, the question is, are there any restrictions receiving multiple concurrent OTAs?
If the question is multiple concurrent awards, no. Typically, when you're going through a consortium, one or more sponsors can solicit however many requirements they wish concurrently. So in the case of our medical technology consortium, which is operated out of my division, we have 5 different Army Medical Research and Development Command sponsors. People in infectious disease, operational medicine, et cetera, et cetera. We just released a solicitation in response to COVID-19 that is co-sponsored by 2 of those 4 sponsors, or 2 of those 5 sponsors. And it may well be that we anticipate making 10 awards in that case. And if you've got more than one thing that addresses more than one requirement, all you have to do is win the competition. I don't want to make it sound like it's that easy, but ultimately all of these awards are made competitively. So if you have the best science, you'll be the selectee.
Great, thank you. Okay, the questions are rolling in. Here we go. The next question is, how are small businesses apprised of OTA funding opportunities?
So the consortia, as they currently are comprised, picture them like a club where the government, by issuing an OT to that consortium, is basically saying, I'm gonna dedicate a portion of my government R&D wallet share that will go strictly to members of this consortium. And by doing that, the consortium maintains a website, and anytime that there's a solicitation coming from the government, that solicitation will be posted on the consortium's website for all the members to see. Many of our consortia also post pre-solicitations, which is kind of the 1 to 2 week heads up there's a solicitation coming, so that individual consortium members can figure out if they have a chance to compete, and if they have a partial solution, it gives them time to go find partners who might want to join with them to strengthen a proposal. I will say that collaboration is key, and particularly in our medical consortium, where you have to take something from an idea through potentially through a clinical trial. It's very rare that one organization alone can do everything, and so we find in the medical consortium an incredible amount of teaming, which we try to foster as much as possible, so that the government gets the best overall proposals, and the opportunities for the best ideas can come forward, even if those great ideas need somebody on their team to help be the commercialization partner.
Great, thank you. We've got about 8 more questions that have come in, and I'm going to bounce around for a second to answer some of them, and then just in the sake of timing, we will maybe hold some of these until the end. But here's a question in relation to what's going on right now with our current COVID-19 pandemic. The question is, where may we find the funding announcements for COVID technologies?
That's a great question. ATI manages 3 consortia that have joined themselves at the hip during this process. So a little bit later in the briefing, I'm going to show you a slide that has all 13 of our consortia that we manage. But if you go on the websites for the Medical CBRN Defense Consortium, the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Consortium, or the Medical Technology Enterprise Consortium, those 3, you can see all of the current COVID-19 medical-related technologies. And I want to stress that it's not completely medical science that we're looking for. One of our solicitations is on a telehealth and remote monitoring, so it's got a very strong IT component to it, as well as the medical component. But I'll make sure I flag those three consortia when we get to the back end of the presentation.
Okay, great. Yeah, I was going to ask that. Could you please pause there and mention that again? A couple other questions have come in about receiving funding. Do you have to be a member of the consortium? And, you know, do you have to participate with ATI consortia to be in the know? Maybe, you know, I'm sure you'll be discussing this in your consortium model slides coming up, but if not, maybe you could go ahead and try to answer some of those, you know, within your slide.
Sure, I'll whet the appetite with a partial answer. In order to propose against any solicitation issued through a consortium, that proposing entity must be a member. In order to receive funding, that member does not necessarily need to be a consortium member. It just can't be the prime. So if you're on a team that's led by a consortium member, that's fine. If you're going to lead a proposal, however, you've got to be a member of the consortium. And virtually all of the consortia have a very nominal annual dues of $500 per year. And that's mostly to offset the expenses for doing the mechanics of consortium membership management and other things that the government won't pay for. The government just funds the research work, not the actual operation of the consortium. ATI's role, and you'll see it in a couple of my subsequent slides, we are absolutely disconnected. We get no vote at all in anything having to do with source selection. We're the process people. We publish the solicitations, we collect the proposals, we screen them to make sure that you haven't forgotten anything, and then send them on to the government, and the government convenes a source selection team to pick what they think are the most responsive proposals for award. And when they have done that source selection, then they notify ATI, and we turn around and put all those performers on contract. So the contract is the money flows through the other transactions agreement from the government sponsor to ATI, and then from ATI to the individual performers who have been selected competitively by the government to do the work.
Thank you for sort of seeding that and, you know, seeding your also, you know, whetting our appetite for your upcoming slides. I'm gonna hand the webinar controls back to you, and I'll let you continue. There are about 4 additional questions that are sitting in the queue, and we can go ahead and answer those at the end of the consortium model section of this webinar. So Russ, whenever you're ready, I will go to the next slide.
Okay, and the next slide should have just a cover slide that says consortium model on it. And so that's where I'm going to pick up here. And this is just for a matter of introduction and perspective. In the 1960s, the Department of Defense accounted for more than 1/3 of global research and development funding. By 2016, the DoD's R&D share of total global R&D fell to 3.7%. To help challenges the DoD faces in acquiring new and innovative technologies and in maintaining U.S. military technical superiority, the DoD has increasingly turned to using the other transactions authority alongside a consortium model. Next slide. So if you have a really tough challenge, is it better to go to just a single company you think is capable and see what solution they propose? Or might you instead explain the challenge to hundreds of companies and thousands of experts and see what kinds of ideas they have. And once that community is built, you can go back to them time and time again for different and subsequent challenges. So obviously, my strong preference would be to build that consortium and make all those ideas available to the funding sponsors. Next slide. So as we construct them, a consortium is a group of private sector businesses, nonprofit organizations, and academic research institutions working with government sponsors to achieve a common goal. And one term I did not mention in that collection of entities is individuals. We currently do not permit individuals by themselves to be consortium members. Nothing, I think, stops an individual from forming his or her own LLC, and an LLC can join the consortium, but right now we do not have provisions for individual members. Typically, the consortium will hire a management organization like ATI to handle its administrative needs and to manage the flow of information from the sponsor to the consortium members. We also consider it part of our role to help minimize the barriers that prevent small, innovative companies from considering joining. We do some training on onboarding of new members when they join to make sure they understand the processes, make sure they have all the required documents they need so that they can then turn around and compete for project awards. Next slide. So for the government, the power of collaboration drives innovation from industry and academia to answer complex challenges as quickly as possible. And we know that small and emerging startup companies are the likeliest place to find cutting-edge technology innovation, but it's also the hardest nut to crack as far as getting those companies connected to the government. And so OT collaborations overcome many of those barriers, and that helps put that innovation to work for the government. On the industry side, the power of collaboration helps you communicate with government customers to understand their needs and then to compete for projects and hopefully advance your technology into the federal marketplace. There's also an opportunity to work with companies larger than your own to contribute to the emerging commercial trends, or to team with companies smaller than your own to access new concepts and technologies. ATI places a very strong premium in all of our consortia on doing everything we can to foster teaming among members. Picture the more traditional mentor-protege relationships that some large companies have, where they want to bring along one or more small companies that have niche technologies that the big company is interested in. That certainly can exist in the consortium model as well. Next slide. So, this slide, it shows the true nature of the public-private partnership and that bridge in the middle. And the bridge document is the other transactions agreement. And that agreement basically connects the lead government agency's agreements officer, the guy or gal who has to sign off on all the project awards, with ATI, the firm or the consortium manager, ATI in this case, the firm that will then translate those source selection decisions into award documents, project awards to the consortium members who have been selected. And you'll note that on the left, as these collaborations grow, typically we find multiple government sponsors will want to use the same vehicle. Our Defense Ordnance Technology Consortium has more than 30 different government funding sponsors who each use the same other transactions vehicle to advertise for their ordnance requirements. So a typical year in our Defense Ordnance Technology Consortium would have hundreds of requirements advertised to a membership base that's now close to 1,000 members. That's just a huge enterprise, but from the perspective of the participating companies, 1,000 different opportunities to compete for project awards on a single vehicle is a lot different than having to go research broad agency announcements or one-off government announcements for solicitations that you either win or you don't, and if you don't, you go home and you have to live for another day. All of these OT agreements are long-term agreements. The shortest one that we've seen is 3 years. The longest we've seen is 10. Most are 5 to 10 years, which means that the same processes with the same government sponsors and a large swath of the same consortium members generates very helpful learning curves, because you're going through the same drill over and over again each time there's a solicitation that's out there. And so you learn over time how to prepare a proposal that's going to be compliant, what the government might be looking for. And so by combining that OT vehicle with all of these technology providers, we think that there's 3 critical acquisition goals that get advanced. The first one is innovation, because the small companies can play. The second one is collaboration, because the OT environment encourages member-to-member and member-to-government dialogue. And finally, speed. A lot of those cumbersome federal acquisition regulations requirements just don't exist, so the processes can go more quickly. Next slide. So here's how the process works from front to back. I've talked about some of these, but it starts with either a pre-solicitation or a solicitation, and that is formed in dialogue, in information exchange between the government and industry. At some point, the government decides they've got enough information to write a solid solicitation that accurately describes what it is they're looking for, and the consortium management firm issues the solicitation to all its members. The solicitation is also published widely on FedBizOps, but the details are not. And that's because, again, the requirement is that the only folks who can propose are members of the various consortia. But when the announcement is out, then it's open for all the consortium members to make individual decisions on whether they wish to propose, whether they want to find a team member to put a proposal together. And ultimately, they generate the proposal, send them back through the consortium manager, and it goes into government source selection. And the government provides the technical subject matter experts to determine which proposals are going to receive funding awards. Those are then communicated to the consortium manager, who puts those projects on award. And this is a key point, and I think I mentioned it earlier in the brief, these are contracts, these aren't grants. So the award consists of the funding document and a statement of work and a milestone payment schedule. And so the performer, who is an awardee, will begin executing their agreed upon statement of work. When they get to one of those agreed upon milestones, they will make that report to the government and submit an invoice for the costs that they've incurred to that point. The government will approve the technical deliverable as acceptable, and then ATI will release the payment, that progress payment for that milestone that you've completed. So you're always being paid for work accomplished and approved, rather than in the grant world being paid up front and then doing the work. So that's a big difference. And I want to stress that, because particularly for the folks in academia who are very, very familiar in the grant world, this is different. Next slide. So this will just be a series of 3 slides in succession to show you some of the benefits of the other transaction model when combined with using a consortium. Next slide shows the industry side of it. You get access to the government stakeholders. You get visibility into the government needs. And for the larger companies, some of them will even use that visibility to direct some of their internal research and development funding toward solicitations that they think are going to come out for which that company thinks they're well qualified. Obviously, it can potentially expand the federal marketplace by drawing in companies that not normally would do business with the government. Talked about speed and contracting, particularly the speed to get things on contract, because a lot of small businesses live month to month and have some significant cash flow challenges. So any delays in the contracting process that can be lessened will help ease some of that cash flow strain, particularly on the small businesses. Next slide. So in order for it to be a real partnership, it also has to work for the government as well as it does for the industry players. And one of the things that our government customers always cite as an advantage of using the OTs is they get a chance to talk to industry. The federal acquisition regulations pretty much shut down any kind of dialogue between government and industry as soon as a solicitation hits the street. And that sometimes prevents useful dialogue that can help a proposer shoot a little closer to the mark of what the government really intends or what they're really looking for. So that information exchange is great. The fact that there are now potentially more solution providers than was on the government's original Rolodex. The speed also helps the government. You know, they have a certain amount of budget authority that they're granted each year, and if they can't get that budget authority contracted and work begun, there's a chance that they will lose that money or get a smaller budget authority in the subsequent years because they've proven their inability to move things through the pipeline. So definitely the speed of the OT is a very positive for the government. And finally, to be able to do the contracting, there's actually a master agreement that's in place between the consortium manager and the individual consortium members that flows down all the terms and conditions from the other transaction agreement between the government and the consortium manager, so that when it's time to do the award, it's basically like a statement of work and a task order rather than a brand new contract. You already know what the terms and conditions are because you can see those. So that helps everybody move faster, and the model is particularly helpful for those government sponsors who have a larger portfolio of R&D needs. I'm not sure it would make a whole lot of sense to go through all the machinations to build a consortium if the government was only going to advertise one or two requirements in a year. You know, why would you keep a 300-member consortium around for that? You probably would. But in a bunch of the technology areas that are currently the subject of technology consortia, the R&D portfolios are broad enough that this model actually works very well. Next slide. So how do you get involved? Well, there's a couple ways. Next slide. First of all, the OT consortium model is a really growing business. In 1998, there was only one such collaboration. Today, there are 30, and a whole bunch of those 30 have come along just in the last 4 years. Next slide. So you can see the names of the consortia, and the left justification of those is tied to the calendar years. As a benchmark, you will see the Medical Technology Enterprise Consortium a little bit below the halfway point. It's bolded. That was in 2015. So a little bit less than half of all the consortia were in existence in 2015, and the vast majority have come on scene since then. It's really been a growth industry, and because this is an ATI brief, I decided to bold those consortia on this slide that we manage. Next slide. To prevent you from having to read the fine print, these are the 13 consortia that we manage, and the websites for each of those are underneath. Those all have public-facing websites that talk about the various technology domains that are covered by the OT agreements for those consortia. So in the medical technology one, there's some description of all 5 of the Army funding sponsors and what kinds of things they're looking for. Same thing in space. There's a fairly long list in the Undersea Technology Innovation Consortium, and so on and so on. So if you want to know, based on the technology area that you happen to be in, which of these consortia might provide you an opportunity, the best thing to do is to go visit their website. And you can find that. And if you have any doubts, please contact one of us at ATI. You'll have my contact info. And next slide. Also, in our program management office, Stacy Lindbergh is one of our chief traffic cops that can look out across all of our 13 consortia. If you have any questions about what is or is not in play, she can connect you to the right program manager. And then finally, one more slide here. We post, we try to keep current on ATI's website all of the funding opportunities that are active. And so, the active solicitations are ones that are out there now and maybe closing in the not too distant future. But for those consortia that actually publish pre-announcements, which probably would be more helpful for all of you, you can see by consortium and by subject matter which things may be getting ready to fly. So if you go to the link that's on this slide, you can peruse what's out there that we ATI are aware of across our 13 consortia that may be coming due for a solicitation. And if you think that that's in your sweet spot, then you can make a decision as to whether or not you want to join a consortium at that time, or try to find a partner that's already a member in one of those consortia and work together on a proposal. So with that, I am going to end my prepared remarks, take your questions, all that remain, and then Julie, if you would just advance to the final slide so that anybody who wants to write down the websites for any of these consortia can have that opportunity now. And so I appreciate all of your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer questions in the time that we have remaining.
Great. Thank you so much, Russ. I just want to follow up on one question that I'm certain you answered, but the question is on the table here. So I just want to ask it again to clarify. Do you have to be a member of the consortium to receive funding?
To receive funding, no. To receive a prime award, yes. So typically, I would say 80% or more of the awards that we see being made by our funding sponsors are going to teams rather than individual companies. So as long as you are on the team, you can be funded, but unless you are a member, you cannot be the prime awardee.
Thank you. So 2 quick questions about small businesses in particular. So the first question is it possible for a small business to, quote, pre-qualify for certain types of OTA awards?
No. In the context of the question, the way, there are 2 ways that a small business could access funding through an OT. The first way is if you happen to have the ability to get on the radar screen of the Defense Innovation Unit, DIU, and there's a lot of press on those. DIU look for innovative companies, mostly in the IT, artificial intelligence, emerging technologies kind of space, And if they think you've got a solution, they will do a direct award via another transactions agreement to that company. The more traditional way is small businesses would join one or more consortia where the technology that they are developing lines up with the domain for those consortia. And then when funding announcements are released to that consortium, then you would propose. Now, again, I go back to the statute that says small businesses don't need to provide cost share. And if a large business is going to go it alone, they would have to provide cost share. Almost 100% of all the awards that we see made through the other transactions agreements for consortium members don't have cost share, which means that even when the ones that go to the large members, those large members have recruited one or more small members who have that significant technology. And so those team members are getting funded, and they are very attractive to the large guys because that helps the large companies avoid that 1/3 cost share.
Thank you, Russ. A couple more questions have come in regard to funding. Here's a question. Let me see which order. What are the typical funding or announcement cycles small businesses should be aware of relative to OTA funding?
That is dependent upon the government sponsor and the consortium. For example, the Information Warfare Research Project, the Undersea Technology Innovation Consortium, and the Defense Ordnance Technology Consortium, I think those are the three main ones, have a specified number of solicitation cycles per year, 1, 2, or 4. The other consortia are asynchronous. Basically, whenever a sponsor has a requirement and has it to the point where it's been appropriately vetted inside the government, they can release those at any time. And so you will find right now in the Medical Technology Enterprise Consortium, we have 19 solicitations that are somewhere in the pipeline between initial release of the solicitation and contract award. Some are still out there waiting for proposals to come in and the proposal deadline to be exercised, and some more are such that the solicitations are closed and those proposals are in evaluation. So across all 13 of our consortia, we probably have 800 or so projects being awarded every year.
That's really good information. I have a question that's come here about the relationship really between the small businesses and the funding agency. Is there ever a case when small businesses can turn to the funding agency to help identify unmet market need that might be, a good, future OTA?
Within the context of your question, yes, but it's not limited only to small businesses. One of the things that all of our consortia that are managed by ATI strive to do is to create interactions between the government funding sponsors and the consortium members. And all of our consortia have at least one general membership meeting of all the consortium members every year. And at that meeting, the government funding sponsors participate. They participate at a high level of here's what we're thinking about doing and funding over the next year. But then in most of the consortia, there's also breakout sessions where companies can sign up and have one-on-one meetings with certain funding sponsors. And that's the time when you can say, well, I've got this technology that's coming along. Or, you know, additionally, in addition to solicitations for proposals, some of these consortia will release requests for project information, RFIs, requests for information, where there's no award at the end, but it's the government casting the net for new ideas. And so there's a chance for consortium members to get some visibility for their ideas that the government may not have thought about yet. So through those two mechanisms, we promote the exchange of ideas between the consortium members and the government funding sponsors.
Great, thank you. The next thing that comes to mind is something that we're all dealing with right now, and that's you know, working from home and teleworking. And can you share what your consortia are doing right now to encourage teaming, and specifically, like, what physical pieces of software are you all using for these, you know, future meetings? Are you holding these, you know, in Zoom? Do you have a digital whiteboard? Do you do digital breakout sessions? Is there software that you are using that is a best practice for you all that we could all be sort of, you know, striving for?
So even before our current new abnormal, we have been promoting anything and everything we can do to connect our members virtually. All of our consortia do what we call speed networking, where we will set up a webinar and we'll invite all the interested parties, give them 2 minutes to present what it is that their technology is and what kind of a partner that they're looking for. And then the audience is open to any member of the consortium. So typically the smaller companies present what their niche areas are, and the bigger companies sit in on these speed networking events to take some notes and to figure out who they might want to reach out to after the fact. Every time there's a solicitation that hits the street, at least in the medical technology consortium that I'm aware of, we convene a proposals conference online, so that connects the government sponsor with anybody who's thinking about proposing and get some of their questions regarding the solicitation answered in that venue. So there's numerous ways to leverage your basic platforms of webinars and conference calls and Zoom to facilitate that dialogue, mostly member to member, but not exclusively. And the one thing that is the potential limiting factor, and we haven't bumped into it a lot, is some of these platforms are certified for controlled, unclassified information, proprietary information, but many are not. And so we're sensitive to making sure that we're using a tool that is appropriate for the information that's going to be shared. For the most part, all the discussions happen in an uncontrolled, non-controlled environment where participants protect their own IP and their own proprietary information, and usually that only ends up in their proposals rather than in these dialogues.
Thank you. Let's see. We have another question about small businesses, and then we'll wrap it up. Does ATI keep a roster of South Carolina small businesses that might be a possible fit for OTA? South Carolina or, nationwide roster?
So that's an awesome question. We have just completed a merging of our 13 individual consortium membership databases. So we are now in a position to say we know the 2,400 different companies across the U.S. who are a member of at least one of our consortia, and we can slice and dice that, and we know how many are in South Carolina, and we know kind of where in the state they are. Because my parent organization used to be SCRA, and back 15 years ago, I actually started my employment with SCRA before I moved over to ATI. I would say that the best source of relevant companies in the state of South Carolina to take a look at some of these opportunities are the launch companies, because you're in that space where you've got a technology that's being developed, and particularly the companies that are closer to those first portfolio investments, those are in the sweet spot for the kinds of technology readiness levels that tend to be solicited through these consortium models.
Well, thank you for the SC launch plug. Always appreciated. We will end on a high note right there. We have 2 other questions that have come in, but I think I'm going to email those to you separately and copy the person asking the question, just because I think we already kind of went over some of those answers, and I will just wrap it up here. But Russ, thank you so much. This is always just an amazing wealth of information type of webinar, and I'm so happy that we have the time to have you on. I hope your family and yourself and everybody on the line is staying safe in these times. And Russ, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone on the phone. Bye.
It's been my privilege. Thank you.